Hello and welcome to lesson 20.1 in the Python tutorial series. Today we're going to move on from some of the projects we've been doing and discuss the len function and an in statement. These are two pretty cool features that you'll be surprised at how often you use in your programs, in particular the len statement. We'll introduce the len function today and see what it does. And at first, if you're anything like me when I was first learning Python, you'll look at the len statement and go, that's neat, but I have no idea how I'm going to use that. It doesn't seem like it would have a ton of functions. And the len function itself is something that I end up using in just about every program, and it allows you to do some really cool things and some really interesting checks and really control the flow of your program. So the len function, while when you're done with this lesson you might not see the use in it, it's a very important function in Python. We're also going to have the in statement, and this will allow us to compare strings and check to see if one thing is contained in another. That is, we can take a look at some words and see if they have specific vowels or do they have specific letters. And hopefully you'll understand lesson 20.1. We'll have the lesson 20.1 challenge program, and as you become a better programmer, you'll start to see these particular statements as second nature because you'll be using them a lot and they make your programs really a lot better. So let's go ahead and get started with the len and in statements. In order to examine the len and in statements, and we'll start with the in statement, we'll just have to remember some of the stuff we learned from earlier lessons about comparison operators. If I were to come over here to the Python shell and just set a variable solution, and we're going to set it equal to the string cat, I can do some comparison checks on this like you've been doing in previous programs. For example, solution equals cat, there's two equal signs, and that's going to return true. Solution is not equal to cat, that should return false. So a comparison operator really is just going to return either a true or a false like we've seen in the if statements. We can use these same comparison operators even though we haven't yet on strings. We've used comparison operators on numbers. Is 4 greater than 10? False. Is 10 greater than 4? True. When we use comparison operators on strings, Python will evaluate those strings alphabetically. So if I were to say, let's take the string house and ask, is house less than howl? It's going to ask, does house come before howl alphabetically? And this is going to return true. And they both start with HO, but since U comes first in the alphabet before W, it returns true. If I were to say, is house greater than howl, I'm going to get false. So when we compare two strings together, Python is doing an alphabetical check and not necessarily a numeric check. But it is possible to use the same comparison operators that you've been using with numbers with strings to check for alphabetization. We can also see, like, if we did a is less than or equal to, if I said A is less than or equal to A, I'll get true. The point is, you're not necessarily going to get syntax errors because you're trying to do comparisons on strings. I think if you were in, like, say, a math class and you tried to compare is A greater than B, most math teachers will kind of cringe at that because you can't compare the numerical value of numbers. But in Python, every letter, or excuse me, you can't compare letter values to one another. But in Python, every single letter has a numerical value. Later on, we'll be doing a ciphering program, and we'll see that more in detail. But for now, just be aware that according to Python, every single letter has a numerical value. So we can compare these things together. Also in Python, if I ask is A equal to A, Python will return false. This means that Python does not interpret capital letters and lowercase letters to be the same thing. They're completely different. When alphabetizing, because of this, capital letters will always come first in Python. So if I said is A greater than B, I'm going to get false. If I get is A less than B, I'll get true. But if I get is a lowercase a less than an uppercase B, that's going to return false. Capital A through Z is alphabetized first before lowercase a through Z. We can't compare strings to numbers. That will give us an error. It will be an unorderable types error. So if I said is A greater than 3 as a number, I'll get that unorderable type error. So that's just a bit of review in how Python is going to handle our strings. This is going to be important when we start using the in command and start using some other things. So why did we do all that? It's because we're going to introduce a new comparison operator that we haven't used before, and that's in. It works just like greater than, equal to, greater than or equal to, not equal to. In as a comparison operator is going to say, is the first part of the line in the second? So I would say, is an in ant? And that's going to return true, because an is part of ant. If I were to say, is se in house, that will also return true, because here's an se in house, and we're looking for se. So it doesn't necessarily have to start with se. It's just looking to see, is se in house? I can check to see, is there a c in house? And we'll get the return false because there is no letter C in house. In order to do an in check, they have to appear in the same order to get a true statement. So I might have the word zoo, and I want to see, is zoo in the word ooze? Well, there is a ZOO, it's just backwards, but Python is going to interpret that as false. I can check an empty string as well. So is there nothing in A, B, C, D, E, F, G? That will return true. When I check an empty string in a string, I'll always get a value of true. So that's how the in statement works. We'll be using that in our example program here in a second, but keep that in mind that in is just a comparison operator to see if one string is in another. So next, let's look at the len statement. The len statement format, or the len function, is len, and it turns purple just like a print statement would to let us know that that's a function. Len will always return an integer, and it will return the length of a string that we've inputted. So let's say I would do the length of the string house. I'm going to return an integer, and that integer will be 5 because there's 5 letters in house. If I were to do len of big sword, wow, I really drew a blank. I was trying to find something there. That's all I could come up with. I'm going to get a value of 9, and that's because this space will count as a character. So we're going to have 5 plus 3 plus the space for 1, and that's going to equal 9. So we're always going to get a number back when we check the length of something. If I were to check the length of an empty string, I'm going to get 0. And that will be really important to keep in mind. An empty string length is always 0. Because these are numbers, I can add them together. So I can say the length of house plus the length of baseball equals 13. When Python evaluates this function, this evaluates to the integer 5, and this evaluates to the integer 8, and 8 plus 5 equals 13, so we can do math like that. And we can also do our additions inside the length statement. So I could say house plus baseball here in a single len statement, and I'm going to get the exact same response. And I can even do string multiplication, just like we did in the very early lessons. If I were to say the length of ha times 10, it's going to return 20, and that's because ha times 10 equals ha 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 ha, and it ends up being 20 characters. So that's how the len function works. It always returns the integer value of the length of the string that we're evaluating. There'll be some more functions for the len statement in later lessons, but for right now, limited to just strings, this is how len and in work. So let's take these two concepts and apply them to a program. It might not seem immediately apparent how this will be useful to you, but when we create our program, it should become a little bit more clear just how powerful these statements can be. So lesson 20.1 is getting a little bit lengthy here, so we're going to go ahead and stop it here. Hopefully you understand how a len function and an in statement are evaluated. In is just a comparison operator, like is greater than, equal to, not equal to, and then the len function will just return a integer that represents the length of the string you've put in it. By themselves, they don't seem like they have a lot of practical use, though. So if you watched lesson 20.2, we're going to develop a program together that uses these to some pretty cool effect. Thank you so much for watching the Python tutorial series. As always, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to field those in the comments. If you're struggling with some code, go ahead and post that to the comments and I'll help you out any way that I can. But we're going to wrap up lesson 20.1 here and head over to lesson 20.2 to see a program developed using the len and in statements. Have a great day.